The year was 1897, and the town of Marble Creek, Missouri was the kind of place that never made it into newspapers. It was small, quiet, and surrounded by thick woods that seemed to swallow sound. Life there moved slowly. People worked their land, minded their business, and trusted that what happened in Marble Creek would stay there. The winters were long, the summers were heavy with heat, and the nights, even in the calmest of times, carried a stillness that felt unnatural. It was the kind of stillness that could make a person hear things that weren't there. At the heart of the town stood a narrow dirt road lined with oak trees so old their roots split the ground beneath them. Lanterns hung from porches, casting thin circles of gold light against the black night. Horses moved quietly in the distance, their hooves dull against the soft mud after rain. You could smell the river from anywhere in town, a slow, iron scent that carried the weight of old secrets. Everyone in Marble Creek had grown used to that smell. It was just part of life, like the church bells at dawn or the distant whistle of the evening train that passed but never stopped. The people were ordinary in every visible way. Farmers, carpenters, widows, and children who played barefoot along the creek bed. But beneath that calm there was something else, something that no one spoke about out loud. Maybe it was the way the townspeople looked away too quickly when someone asked about the woods north of town. Or maybe it was how no one stayed out past dark, even on the warmest summer nights. Marble Creek had its routines, and those routines kept everyone safe, or at least that's what they told themselves. In that summer of 1897, the town's most respected man lived on a hill just beyond the edge of town. His home was not grand, but it was the largest for miles, a two-story farmhouse with wide windows and a front porch that always seemed to catch the morning light just right. People said he was a fair man, one who gave jobs when others couldn't, one who smiled in church and paid his debts early. But the closer you got to knowing him, the harder it became to tell what that smile really meant. He had a way of watching people without blinking, a way of talking that made you feel like you owed him something, even when you didn't. He had a wife too, quiet, polite, and almost ghostly in the way she moved. She was younger than he by a good many years, though no one knew exactly how many. Some said she had come from St. Louis, others whispered that she was from across the river in Illinois. What everyone agreed on was that she had changed since marrying him. Once lively, she now rarely left the house. When she did, she wore gloves, even in the heat, and kept her eyes lowered when people spoke to her. There were rumors, of course, rumors that she had been unwell, that her husband didn't like her talking too much, that she'd been seen once, crying at the edge of the woods. But rumors were all anyone had. The couple had one servant, a young man who did the farm work and kept the house in order. He was quiet too, though for different reasons. He had come from a neighboring county looking for work and keeping to himself. People in town said he was loyal, that he did whatever the man of the house asked. But when he looked at the woman, there was something strange in his eyes, a mix of pity and fear, as if he knew something he shouldn't. That summer, something about the air began to change. The nights grew heavier, the insects louder, the woods darker. The river flooded once in June, swallowing the low fields and leaving behind a stench that lingered for weeks. People started locking their doors earlier. A dog went missing, then a child. No one connected it to the hill at first. No one wanted to. But people noticed things. Lights burning late in the farmhouse windows, strange shapes moving through the fog near the barn, a scream that someone claimed to have heard one night but couldn't prove. The man of the house said it was nonsense, that people were letting their imagination run wild. And maybe they were. Marble Creek was a lonely place. When the moon was high and the wind turned, the woods played tricks on people. Still, even the preacher's wife admitted she didn't sleep well that summer. The sound of the wind against her window began to sound too much like whispering. By July, the woman on the hill had stopped coming to church altogether. Some said she was sick again, others said she had left. A few even said she was still there but didn't want to be seen. The servant boy kept working, quieter than ever, and when someone asked about her, he only said, "She's resting." The town carried on, but the tension hung in the air like a storm that refused to break. People began to feel watched, by what they couldn't say. Doors creaked in the night. Footsteps echoed on empty roads. And one morning the river carried something strange down from the north woods, something that made even the sheriff turn pale when he saw it. Before the first scream, before the first grave was dug, Marble Creek was just another small town in Missouri. But after that summer of 1897, it would never be the same again. By late July, Marble Creek had grown uneasy in a way that was hard to explain. The air itself seemed heavier, like it carried something no one wanted to name. The nights stretched longer, the silence sharper. The townsfolk noticed that the farmhouse on the hill had changed. The shutters stayed closed even on sunny mornings, the fields weren't tended as neatly, and the man who owned the land seemed colder than before, more watchful, more suspicious of everyone around him. He started coming into town more often, usually to the general store or to the post office, though people suspected he wasn't there for business. He asked questions that didn't seem like questions, casual things like who'd been visiting whom or whether the preacher's son had been walking near the property again. But his tone carried something behind it, a warning maybe. He wanted to be seen, to be known as someone who still controlled things, even when his life was quietly starting to fall apart. The talk about his wife hadn't died down. If anything, it had grown worse. Someone claimed they'd seen her at the upstairs window one night, staring out with her hand pressed against the glass. Another said they'd heard her voice calling faintly from the woods. No one could agree on the details, but they all felt that something wasn't right in that house. The sheriff made a polite visit once, claiming it was routine. When he came back down the hill, his face was pale. He told the barber later that everything seemed fine, but he never went back. Inside that house, things were unraveling faster than anyone knew. The woman was not sick in the way people thought. She wasn't coughing or bedridden. She was trapped in a house where every word she spoke was weighed and twisted. Her husband had grown crueler, less patient. He accused her of lying, of hiding letters, of looking too long at the servant boy. Every evening brought another round of quiet arguments that ended with slammed doors or the sound of something breaking. The servant boy, who had once moved through the house like he wasn't there, now found himself caught in the middle of something he didn't understand. He tried to keep his head down to do his work, but he heard things. Half-whispered confessions through the door, quiet sobs late at night, the heavy steps of the man packing the hall long after midnight. The boy pitied her, yes, but pity slowly turned into something else. He began to notice her in ways he hadn't before. The way her hands shook when she poured tea, the soft sadness in her voice when she spoke of the world beyond the hill. One afternoon, when the man was away in town, the boy found her standing at the edge of the porch, staring out at the trees. She asked him if he ever thought about leaving Marble Creek. He said he didn't have anywhere to go. She smiled faintly and said, "Neither do I." That small moment stayed with him. It was the first time she had spoken to him like an equal, not a servant, and from then on, something between them changed. The man noticed it almost immediately. He could sense it in the way she paused before answering him, or how the boy avoided his eyes. He began setting traps, not physical ones, but small, psychological ones. He'd ask her where she'd been when he already knew. He'd send the boy to fetch something and then accuse him of taking too long. Every question, every remark was meant to remind them that he saw everything, that they were both under his control. Money troubles began to press down on him, too. The crops hadn't done well that year, and the bank had started asking questions about overdue payments. For a man like him, proud, well-regarded, and obsessed with appearances, failure was worse than death. He couldn't bear the idea of being pitied. So he hid the letters from the bank, burned them in the stove, and took out his anger on the only two people who couldn't fight back. The wife started keeping a diary, writing in small, trembling letters late at night. She hid it behind a loose board in the wardrobe. In those pages, she tried to make sense of her life, the man she had once thought she loved, the loneliness that had swallowed her, the growing fear that she would never be allowed to leave. Sometimes she wrote about the boy, not by name, but by feeling. She wrote about the way he looked at her, not with desire, but with something like sorrow. She wondered if he might be the only person who still saw her as human. In early August, there was a storm unlike any Marble Creek had seen in years. The rain came down in sheets, thunder rolling like cannon fire across the valley. That night, the power in the house went out and the candles burned low. The man had been drinking, muttering to himself about betrayal and lies. At some point, he stumbled into the parlor and found the boy standing near the stairs. He accused him of stealing money, of sneaking into rooms he didn't belong in. The boy denied it, but the man didn't want to hear the truth. He shoved him hard enough to make him fall, and when the boy stood again, his eyes were different, angrier, colder. Something broke that night, though no one spoke of it afterward. The next morning, the wife found the servant boy packing his few belongings. He said he was leaving, that he'd had enough. She begged him to stay, not because she wanted him to, but because she knew what her husband would do if he left. He hesitated, torn between fear and pity. In the end, he stayed, but something in him had changed forever. By mid-August, the man was no longer the polished figure the town knew. He stopped shaving. He stopped going to church. He started spending nights alone in the barn, muttering to himself, keeping ledgers no one was allowed to see. The servants in nearby farms said they could hear strange noises coming from his land at night, scraping sounds, like shovels on dirt. One man swore he saw him walking near the river with a lantern long after midnight. The wife grew thinner, paler. She barely spoke now. When she did, her voice carried a kind of hollow calm, like she had already accepted something inevitable. The boy noticed bruises she tried to hide. He noticed the way she jumped when she heard her husband's boots on the stairs. And one evening, when the man came home and found them speaking quietly in the kitchen, he didn't shout. He just smiled. That smile was worse than any outburst. The next day, the man went into town and ordered a new lock for the cellar door. When the blacksmith asked what happened to the old one, he said it had rusted. But the old lock wasn't broken. It was just too easy to open from the inside. The townsfolk began to avoid talking about the farmhouse altogether. Even the preacher said it was best to leave that family to their private troubles. But privately, people were scared. A hunter swore he'd seen the woman walking barefoot near the creek one night, her dress soaked and torn. Another man said he heard a scream echo from the hill, but found nothing when he went looking. In early September, a letter arrived at the post office addressed to a woman in St. Louis. The handwriting was uneven, desperate. It never reached her because the man intercepted it before it could be sent. When he read it, something inside him snapped completely. The letter spoke of escape, of fear, of needing help. It spoke of what she knew he had done, something the town had not yet discovered, something buried beneath the soil. That night, the lanterns in the farmhouse burned until dawn. Neighbors saw shadows moving back and forth in the windows, fast and frantic. Then silence. By the following morning, smoke was seen rising from the fields, and the river once again began to carry things that did not belong there. The sheriff rode up the hill the next day but returned alone. When people asked what he found, he said only, "You don't want to know." In Marble Creek, life went on because it had to. But the whispers never stopped. The house on the hill became a dark mark on the town's memory, a reminder that even in a place so quiet, evil could grow slowly, quietly behind closed doors, fed by fear, pride, and a love that turned into something far worse. The night of the crime began like any other, silent, windless, and unbearably still. The moon hung low over the Missouri hills, pale and thin, throwing long silver shadows through the oak trees that surrounded the farmhouse. The air felt wrong, too quiet, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Inside the house, a single lamp burned in the parlor, its flame flickering weakly against the dark. The man sat in his chair, glass in hand, his eyes fixed on the empty hallway. He had been awake for hours, waiting. On the kitchen table lay the torn remains of a letter, the same one he had found hidden beneath his wife's pillow 2 nights before. It wasn't just the words that broke him. It was the tone, the trembling hope in her handwriting, the way she had written about leaving, about being free. She had even written that someone would help her, though she hadn't dared to say who. But he knew. He had known for weeks. The thought of it, his wife conspiring under his roof, whispering to his servant, filled him with a kind of madness that no logic could reach. The wife was upstairs, standing before the mirror, her hands shaking as she fastened her coat. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her reflection pale and frightened. The bag at her feet was small, barely enough for a day's travel. She wasn't sure where she would go, only that she couldn't stay. She had left a note, a short one, and placed it on the dresser. "Forgive me. I cannot live like this any longer." She didn't know if she meant it for him or for herself. Downstairs, the man heard the floorboards creak. He didn't move. He simply waited, listening to her slow, careful steps. The boy was outside, waiting by the barn with the horse saddled. They had planned it for days. The river road would take them to the next county before sunrise. It was desperate, dangerous, but it was the only way out. She paused at the top of the stairs, clutching the railing. For a moment she thought she saw movement in the parlor, a shadow that shouldn't have been there. Her breath caught. But she told herself it was nothing, that he must be asleep. She began to descend, step by step, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. When she reached the bottom, he spoke, his voice low, steady, and terrifyingly calm. "Going somewhere." The sound froze her in place. The lamp light flickered, revealing his face in the half-dark. His eyes were hollow, sunken, like a man who hadn't slept in days. He stood slowly, setting the glass aside. "You were going to leave me," he said, "after everything I've done for you." Her lips parted, but no words came. She could feel her throat closing. "Please," she whispered, "you don't understand." He stepped closer. "Oh, I understand," he said softly. "I understand perfectly." His voice trembled, not with sadness, but rage. "You were going to run with him, weren't you?" Her silence was answer enough. He laughed, a short, broken sound, and moved past her toward the door. She followed his gaze and felt her stomach drop. Through the small window above the door, a shadow moved. The boy. He was waiting for her signal. The man opened the door suddenly, the hinges shrieking. The boy froze outside, caught in the lamplight. For a moment, no one spoke. The air was so tense it could have shattered. Then, without a word, the man stepped onto the porch and struck the boy across the face. The sound echoed through the night like a gunshot. The boy stumbled but didn't fall. "You think you can take her from me?" the man hissed. "You think you can come into my home and make a fool of me?" The woman screamed, rushing forward, but he shoved her back. The boy swung at him, fists clenched, wild and desperate. The two men struggled, their bodies crashing against the wooden rail. The lantern fell and shattered, spilling oil across the floorboards. Flames flared up, licking the porch, the smell of burning oil filling the air. The fight was clumsy, frantic. The boy wasn't strong, but he was young, desperate, fueled by something close to madness. The man fought like a cornered animal, his rage blinding him. In the chaos, the woman grabbed his arm, screaming for him to stop. He turned on her, eyes wide, and shoved her aside again. She hit the ground hard, her head striking the edge of the step. The sound was sickening. For a moment, everything stopped. The boy froze, staring at her motionless body. The man's breath came in short, sharp gasps. Then he looked down and saw the blood running from her temple. "No, no," he muttered, stumbling back. "You made me do this." The flames grew higher, spreading to the porch beams. The boy lunged at him again, this time with fury beyond reason. They fell together, crashing through the half-rotted railing and into the mud below. The man's hand found the shovel that had been left by the barn earlier that evening. He swung it once, twice, wild, heavy blows. The boy cried out, then fell silent. The only sound left was the fire, crackling and greedy. When it was over, the man stood there in the orange glow, his chest heaving, mud and blood mixing under his boots. He looked back toward the porch. The fire had begun to climb the walls now, reaching for the roof. His wife hadn't moved. Her hair caught the light like strands of gold. He staggered up the steps, calling her name. She didn't answer. He tried to lift her, but his hands were shaking too badly. He could smell the smoke now, thick and choking. Somewhere behind him, the barn horse screamed, terrified by the flames. He backed away, coughing, as the fire swallowed the doorway. He stood there for a long moment, unable to move, watching everything he owned, the house, the woman, the life he had built, burn into nothing. Then he turned and walked toward the river. His movements were slow, almost dreamlike. He carried something wrapped in cloth, the boy's body, limp and heavy. He dragged it through the mud to the riverbank, where the water moved black and slow. The river had always been Marble Creek's quiet witness, keeping secrets for those who didn't want them found. The man dropped the body into the current and watched as it disappeared beneath the surface. The water rippled once, then went still. When he looked back toward the hill, the sky was bright with fire. He could hear the distant cries of neighbors, now faint but growing closer. He knew they'd come running. He knew what they'd see, the burning house, the charred remains of the porch, the blood on the steps. And he knew what he would tell them. He would say it was an accident, that there had been an intruder. He tried to save her. But as he stood by the river, something inside him began to unravel. He saw her face again, the way she looked at him in those last seconds, not with fear, but with pity. It was that look that haunted him more than the fire, more than the blood. By the time the neighbors reached the house, the roof had already collapsed. They found him sitting by the road, covered in soot, his hands shaking, his eyes empty. When the sheriff asked what happened, he said only one word: fire. They searched for the boy for days, but never found him. The river gave nothing back. Some said the current took him all the way down to the Mississippi. Others said he never made it that far. The woman's body was found in the ashes of the parlor, her face untouched by the flames, her eyes open as if she had been waiting for someone to come. The town mourned her quietly. They buried her near the churchyard, though no one spoke of what they suspected. The man didn't attend the funeral. He stayed in the jailhouse, staring at the wall, repeating the same words over and over. "I didn't mean to." But everyone in Marble Creek knew that something far darker had happened on that hill. They could feel it in the air, in the way the river moved more slowly that week, in the silence that settled after the fire. The farmhouse never stood again. The land remained black and empty, the earth beneath it heavy with secrets too terrible to name. And on some nights, when the wind blew down from the woods, people swore they could still hear her voice in the distance, soft, broken, and calling for help that would never come. The morning after the fire, Marble Creek woke to a silence that felt unnatural. The smoke from the hill still hung low over the town, a gray veil that carried the sharp scent of burnt wood and something else, something no one wanted to name. By sunrise, people had already begun walking toward the farmhouse, drawn by the glow that had lit the sky through the night. No one spoke as they climbed the muddy path. They didn't need to. Everyone knew something terrible had happened. When they reached the ruins, the house was nothing but blackened beams and piles of ash. The air was thick with heat and the soft hiss of dying embers. The sheriff was already there, hat in hand, his boots dark with soot. He stood a few feet away from the man who once owned that hill, watching him sit on a stone with his head bowed. His clothes were scorched, his hands blistered, and his eyes blank, like all the life had been drained out of him. When the sheriff asked what happened, the man gave the same answer each time. "The fire started in the kitchen. I tried to save her." His voice was dull, empty. He sounded like someone repeating a story he no longer believed. The sheriff didn't press him at first. There was too much chaos, too many things that didn't make sense. The neighbors spoke in hushed tones. Some said they saw two figures fighting on the porch before the flames took hold. Others swore they heard a scream by the river, but no one could be sure. All they knew for certain was that the woman was gone, the servant boy had vanished, and the man on the hill was the only one left alive to tell the story. The next few days passed in a strange blur. The sheriff ordered a search of the riverbanks, though few believed they'd find anything. The water ran high that week, swollen from the storm. They dragged it anyway, pulling up branches, old tools, and debris, but no body. The boy had disappeared as if the earth itself had swallowed him. Some said he fled out of fear, that he'd been guilty of something. Others whispered darker things, that the river had taken him as punishment for crossing a man like that. The man himself was taken into custody, though not officially arrested. The sheriff said it was for his own safety, but everyone understood what that meant. They put him in a cell at the back of the small jailhouse where the smell of smoke still clung to him like a shadow. He didn't eat much. He didn't speak unless spoken to. When the preacher came to pray with him, he refused to look up. "I didn't mean to," he said again, almost pleading. "She fell. I tried to save her. It was an accident." But no one, not even the preacher, believed that anymore. The town, once full of routine and small gossip, now revolved entirely around the tragedy on the hill. The church bells rang for the funeral that Sunday. The service was short, quiet, and heavy with unspoken truth. Her coffin was closed, though people said her face hadn't burned. She looked peaceful, as if she'd only fallen asleep. The preacher spoke of forgiveness, of God's plan, but there was no comfort in his words. The townspeople kept glancing toward the back, half expecting the man to appear. He didn't. He stayed locked in his cell, staring through the bars at the floor. After the burial, the whispers began to take shape. People started remembering things they hadn't noticed before. The bruises on her arms, the way she'd stopped smiling months ago, the boy's quiet fear whenever her husband entered a room. They pieced together a story that the sheriff never officially confirmed, but that everyone believed. She'd tried to leave, and he'd caught her. The fire had not been an accident. Weeks passed, but Marble Creek couldn't shake the weight of what had happened. The air seemed colder, the nights darker. Parents kept their children close, warning them not to wander near the river. The man's name, once spoken with respect, became something bitter. Storekeepers stopped mentioning him altogether. The house on the hill became a place people looked away from, a scar in the landscape that reminded them how quickly goodness could turn to cruelty. Inside the jail, the man began to change. The anger that had once kept him upright began to dissolve into something else, something smaller, sadder. He stopped defending himself. He stopped asking for a lawyer. He only asked one thing, that no one rebuild the house. When the sheriff asked why, he said quietly, "Because she's still there." At night, he would wake screaming, shouting her name. Sometimes he claimed he saw her standing in the corner of the cell, her face pale, her eyes accusing. The sheriff, a man who didn't believe in ghosts, still refused to enter that cell alone after dark. He said the air in there was too cold, even in the middle of August. The official inquiry dragged on for months. Without the boy's body, the case was difficult to prove. Some in town believed the sheriff didn't push too hard. He pitied the man because deep down, everyone knew he had already punished himself more than any court could. In the end, the case was closed as unresolved. The fire was listed as accidental. The man was released before winter, though no one wanted him back. When he returned to the ruins of the farmhouse, the land was empty except for the blackened foundation and the twisted frame of the porch. The oak trees stood like silent witnesses, their trunks marked by soot. He didn't try to rebuild. He pitched a small tent near the edge of the property and stayed there alone. People passing by sometimes saw him sitting near the ashes, whispering to himself. They said he looked thinner, hollow, like someone waiting for something that would never come. The town slowly moved on, though it never forgot. The preacher spoke once more about sin and mercy, trying to bring peace to the uneasy hearts of his flock. But even he confessed later that the air around Marble Creek never felt the same again. Children grew up hearing stories about the hill, about the woman who had tried to escape, and the man who lost everything because he couldn't let her go. By spring, the man disappeared. Some said he left town in the middle of the night, walking along the riverbank toward the south. Others said they found his coat near the water weeks later, caught in the reeds. The sheriff ordered another search, but nothing was found. The river had taken another secret, and the town didn't ask for it back. Years passed, and the ruins of the farmhouse were slowly reclaimed by the earth. Wildflowers grew where the porch once stood. The sound of the river carried on, quiet and steady. But even decades later, old-timers in Marble Creek still swore that on certain nights, when the wind came from the north, you could see a faint orange glow on the hill, as if the fire had never really gone out. They said that if you stood by the river long enough, you could hear voices, too. A woman's soft whisper, a man's broken apology, and the quiet cry of someone young, calling for help that never arrived. The people of Marble Creek learned to live with those sounds, with the knowledge that their peaceful little town had once harbored something unspeakable. In the end, there were no winners, no justice that could fix what had been done. There was only the river, the smoke, and the memory of a love that had rotted into possession. Marble Creek moved on because time demanded it, but the story of the farmhouse on the hill became part of the land itself, a warning that even in the quietest places, the darkest things can grow unseen until it's far too late. When the gavel finally fell in that cold Missouri courtroom, it was as if the whole town of St. Aureliah exhaled after holding its breath for months. The newspapers called it the trial that split a state, and they weren't wrong. It wasn't just about the murder, it was about power, love, and the ugly things people do when their world begins to slip away. By the time the final verdict was read, no one walked away untouched. Henry Caldwell sat motionless as the judge read the sentence. His face was pale, drained of every ounce of arrogance that once defined him. He had always been the man who controlled everything, his estate, his reputation, his wife's every move. But now, shackled and surrounded by deputies, that illusion shattered. He was found guilty of second-degree murder, not premeditated, they said, but a crime of passion. The jury couldn't deny the storm of emotions that built up before that fateful night, the jealousy, the control, the humiliation. It was a verdict that left everyone uneasy. Some said it was justice, others whispered it was mercy. The townspeople gathered outside the courthouse, their faces a mixture of anger and sadness. To them, the Caldwells were once a symbol of pride, wealthy, respected, generous donors to the church and local orphanage. Now they were a cautionary tale. Every gossip circle in Missouri had an opinion. Some pitied Henry, believing he lost his mind in the heat of betrayal. Others despised him, saying he finally showed the monster he had always been behind closed doors. Clara's body was buried on a gray afternoon, the sky hanging low like it couldn't bear to look. Few people attended. Many were too afraid to be seen choosing sides. Those who did come stood in silence, heads bowed, avoiding each other's eyes. Her brother, Thomas, was there, his expression distant, hollowed out by months of grief and guilt. He blamed himself for not taking her away when she begged him to. He remembered her letters, the subtle cries for help he had brushed off as marital troubles. It was too late now. All that was left of his sister was a grave under a dying oak tree. In the months that followed, the story of the Caldwell murder became something of a legend. Reporters from St. Louis and even Chicago wrote long pieces about it, each one twisting the facts a little more for the sake of drama. Some painted Clara as a trapped wife desperate for freedom, others made her out to be manipulative, saying she pushed Henry beyond reason. The truth was buried under public fascination, as it often is. No one really wanted the truth. They wanted a story that made sense of the chaos. Inside his prison cell, Henry's pride slowly rotted away. At first, he refused to speak to anyone. He wouldn't eat, wouldn't write letters, wouldn't accept visitors. But after months of silence, he began to write confessions that were never sent. In those letters, he described how the jealousy had consumed him, how he could feel it crawling under his skin like a fever. He wrote that he didn't mean to kill her, that everything happened too fast, but the more he wrote, the less certain he sounded. By the end, even he didn't know if he was telling the truth or trying to comfort himself. Back in St. Aureliah, the Caldwell estate was left to decay. The servants were gone, the gardens overgrown, and the house sat in silence, its windows dark and empty. People said they could still hear Clara's voice in the wind that swept through the hills, calling out in the night. Others claimed they saw Henry's shadow wandering the grounds, even though he was miles away behind bars. Whether those stories were true didn't matter. They became part of the town's identity. St. Aureliah would forever be known for what happened in that house on the hill. The case also left its mark on the town's sense of morality. Before the murder, people used to believe that wealth protected you from consequence. The Caldwells' downfall shattered that illusion. It made people question what really went on behind closed doors, how much pain and cruelty could be hidden under polite smiles. The church preached forgiveness, but the whispers in the pews said otherwise. It became clear that even in small towns, evil didn't always come from strangers. It could live quietly next door. For Thomas, the years after the trial were heavy with bitterness. He became an advocate for women's rights, speaking out in church halls and town meetings, arguing that too many women were trapped in marriages like Clara's, controlled, silenced, and dismissed. His speeches didn't make him popular, but they made people think. He wanted justice for his sister, but what he really wanted was to make sure no one else suffered the same way. Henry died in prison 3 years later. The guards found him one morning slumped against the wall, his eyes open but empty. No one claimed his body. The state buried him in an unmarked grave on the edge of the prison yard. In the end, he became exactly what he feared most: forgotten. But the town never truly forgot the pain he left behind. Years turned into decades, and the Caldwell house remained untouched. Children dared each other to sneak inside, and locals told stories about hearing faint piano music from the parlor where Clara once played. Her portrait, they said, still hung above the fireplace, her painted eyes following anyone who entered. The truth of what happened there, how love turned to fear and fear turned to death, became twisted by time. But the lesson stayed the same. No matter how grand a house or how perfect a family seems, darkness can grow quietly inside it until it swallows everything whole. Looking back, the case revealed more than a murder. It revealed a truth about human nature. Power, once given to the wrong hands, can destroy everything it touches. Love, when mixed with control, turns poisonous. And justice, even when served, cannot bring peace to the dead or the living. In Missouri's long history of tragedy, the Caldwell case stood apart because it wasn't about greed or revenge. It was about fear. Fear of losing control, fear of being trapped, fear of being alone. And that fear, once ignited, burned through 2 lives and scarred an entire town. Even now, more than a century later, people still speak of it with a kind of quiet unease. They say the story is cursed, that every generation in St. Aureliah has one night when the wind carries the sound of a woman crying from the old Caldwell house. No one dares to go near it then, because everyone knows what happened there was real, and some things, no matter how much time passes, never really go away.